Welcome to another episode of Medicine 3.0. This week, I have two PhDs in exercise performance, exercise science. They are Merritt and Morgan Smith. So Mo and Mo, but I can't call them Mo and Mo in the podcast, or I wouldn't know who I'm talking to. They probably wouldn't either. But it was such an amazing conversation. Merritt has done a lot on mindset and how to help athletes be their very best. She works with the Olympic team, the Paralympic team. Morgan Smith is at Stanford doing her postdoctorate right now, and she is studying the molecules that you can measure to see how people are performing and help them perform better. You might not think that these two things go together, but this was such a great conversation in seeing how what you measure matters and how your mindset works matters. And it comes down to how healthy you are. And I think this is a great conversation and shows how being an athlete is a spectrum. We are all athletes of our own life. So I really hope you enjoy this podcast. All right. Dr. Smith, Dr. Merritt, welcome to the podcast. First, Morgan, will you just tell us how you got where you're at, knowing what you know?
Absolutely. Well, hello, and I'm so excited and grateful to be on this podcast. So I started at the University of Florida, and I was a kinesiology major. I was an athlete in high school, and so I knew that I always wanted to be around sport in some capacity. And I thought, well, I'm going to be a physical therapist. I was in physical therapy all the time. And so I was like, I love being there. I just want to keep doing this. And so I started on that track, taking like my gen eds and stuff like that. And I ended up wanting to work in the weight room. I was like, well, I want to be a personal trainer. I think that could be really fun. So I had this kind of typical path of kinesiology, personal trainer. And as I kept going through it, I loved it. I loved working with people. I loved being able to push them to their limits and figure out what they can do. And the more I took classes, the more I realized there's more out there. There's more science. You can actually really understand what a training paradigm is and what it's doing to the body. And so that kind of propelled me to go into a master's program to just keep learning more about the body, learning about movement. And I actually ended up getting a summer job in a research lab that did exercise studies, but in animal models. And I was like, it's still exercise. Like I can still relate to it. And it was a really valuable experience in putting me on the path of science and on research. And I knew that I didn't want to work with animals anymore. They were great. It was a good experience. And I wanted to pivot back to working with humans. And so that, again, pushed me to the next step of going to get my PhD at Auburn University, where I was in Dr. Mike Roberts' lab, working with humans and figuring out, okay, how do we understand how the body works in response to training, supplements, and just really diving more into that science aspect. And then from there, I was like, I want to keep going. Now, how can I do the science of more higher or elite performance and working with athletes or people that just really want to get after it? And so that led me to Stanford, where I'm now doing postdoc research for essentially applied human performance work. So I work with primarily female athletes, but in general, how can we better understand human performance, not just to optimize it, but to improve it. So that's where I am now. That's where I started as a personal trainer, just wanting to be around movement, and it's kind of bopped me around here. And I never anticipated being here, and even being a postdoc. That wasn't in my plans. After I was getting my PhD, I was like, I just want to work. That was my plan. And now I'm here and I'm loving it.
That's awesome. You just kept going to school and then they gave you a doctorate.
Yeah. I actually had a participant once that said, you've been in school since you were 3. I was like, yes, thank you for putting it in that perspective.
That's awesome. All right, Mo, your story.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for having me here today. I apologize for the voice is gone. I'm coaching high school basketball right now, and it's the kickoff of the season, so just a little bit raspy. My story starts off, I would say, beginning while I was in school. My mom was a nurse, so she still is. And so when I was going to college, one of the first things that she encouraged me to do was like, hey, you should become a nurse, and this is an option. And I come from a family of nurses, so was very interested in the field of just well-being, health, and understanding where it could take me. But there was immediate pushback from me. I was like, I don't want to do this, Mom. And so then ended up in a happy medium with kinesiology. And this put me in a really interesting space while playing collegiate basketball in college, having a better understanding of what we were doing in practice, going into the weight room, talking to our athletic trainers. So getting this full 360 view of, okay, what are all the components that kind of fall into performance, and then unpacking and kind of leaning into the mental side is really where I landed. And following graduation from my undergraduate degree with in exercise science, then moved to Auburn, Alabama to compete with the national handball team with Team USA. And so, again, that was a secondary introduction to one, furthering my education within the space of kinesiology, and then further diving into what does performance look like on the deeper kind of education and research based level. And one of the things that I would say just that kind of sticks core to me is just having to learn a new sport from ground zero. And that humbling experience, learning something totally new, was extremely valuable to me during that process. And went on to enroll in the PhD program down there at Auburn, where Morgan and I met. And my research area focused on personality change, mindset, and was able to engage with the ROTC a bit. I'm sure that we may also get to. And then also taking on some internships within the sport space. So being able to have the research and then go on to work to apply it right away. From there, that's landed me into a role with the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, working within sport performance, supporting Team USA and just achieving more all across the board, whether that's directly with athletes or with our organizing sport organizations. And have been in that role for just over a year now, and are continuing to settle. And then my other side of my passion is coaching and teaching youth athletes and supporting people in developing their knowledge, just to have the self-agency to go on and be successful in whatever they're trying to do. So it's a blur of where I am right now.
That's awesome. Are you working right now, or are you postdoc also?
I'm working right now.
Okay, awesome. So working for the Olympic team, the Paralympic team. I'm curious, I know handball is going to be in the next Olympics. The U.S. team will have a team there. Are you going to be trying to be on the team?
That's a good question. Right now, that's TBD. I'll keep keeping it close to the vest, but we'll see. We'll see. It's not. We'll see.
That's awesome. I've been pitching all the athletic people that I know that have never had a chance to be Olympians. I'm like, you need to go learn handball because this is the opportunity to go to the Olympics.
Very much so. Very much so. There are a few sports where, if you think you've got it, this is the time now.
That's awesome. I love that. All right. Well, let's jump back, Morgan. So you talked about you're studying kind of applied performance right now. What does that entail?
Yeah, it entails a lot of data collection on the field in a room full of athletes and in chaos. And kind of taking a step back in terms of applied sports science, human performance, there's a lot of language in there, but essentially applied work. And so what that means is we're going to the athletes wherever they're performing and practicing and collecting data there. Then from that point is like, how are we implementing this information? So not only from the athlete education perspective, but so we're giving all of their testing back, and I'll give some examples of that. But we're also incorporating the coaches and their strength coach and their AT, and saying, okay, this is what we're seeing. And there's like right now, data privacy is a really big thing. So in terms of this applied sports science space, it's like, how can we collect data that's going to be useful, and that we can be able to provide back to the coaches that's going to keep the athletes safe, and that can't be used against them, and that is really useful. And especially now with so much of sports science kind of going into like this data analytics, data science space, you can get a report with 1,000 metrics on it. It's like, awesome. Now what do I do with this? And so it's really figuring out and teasing out those variables that are important and that are useful. And some of that is trial and error. We don't necessarily know, or we might think that something may be informative and it turns out not to be. And it's a really cool opportunity to marry science and art. And Mo and I talk about this a lot, of especially like, she's a coach. I also coach track and field, and it's coach's eye. It's being able to incorporate the subjective knowledge from a coach and marrying that with objective data, science, and those type of things, and making sure that both of those have equal respect in terms of, it doesn't have to be numerical for it to be important. And so that's what I like to do in this applied space of, so for example, I'm doing a study with the women's rowing team. And so we're collecting lactate, we're collecting different markers of inflammation. And so we're giving that back to the athletes. They get to see what their, lactate post a hard 2x5K is. And they're like crawling over to us to like get their finger pricks, to get their finger pricks. And so it's getting that real-time data, but then we're doing it over time. So we're looking at how these responses change over time in terms of peak performance. So like as they go into NCAAs, that's when they want to be at their very best. And so we're looking at inflammatory markers. We're looking at how they sleep to see if they're putting themselves in the best position possible at that point in the season. So that's kind of an example of what that looks like. There's some labs that, they go to games or matches and they can get saliva samples, or they can get, typically it's a saliva or a finger prick, because, you're not going to prick someone's arm in the middle of a game. So that's kind of what that looks like for me right now. And it's really exciting, to get the athletes involved, and, because they're really knowledgeable and they want to know what's happening in their bodies. And they have this, like, the context of them being like the subject matter expert of their sport. And so you're trying to come in and learn from them and say, okay, what is something that you're interested in? What are questions that you have, barriers that you are trying to overcome? And then how can we add science into that where it's not a high burden? Something to keep in mind when you're collecting data on people is you don't want to have them for a long time. You don't want it to be painful, and you want it to be quick. So how can you, do the very best that you can, and from a science perspective, to be able to marry that in the sport context? So that's where I'm at right now. So it's great.
I love the one thing that you said about the coach's eye, and, with artificial intelligence progressing the way it is, I get asked all the time, like, are doctors going to be around for that long? Like, can't AI just take care of people? And I think it's very similar to like the coach's eye, the physician's eye. Like, you can't tell everything just from data. And so I like that you kind of pulled that out. Even if you see somebody's saliva cortisol or their lactate or whatever it is that you're measuring, like, there is, like, the inner will. People often surprise us and go beyond. So I think that's super cool. And I think that actually leads over really nicely into Mo, you taking care of people's mindset and helping people with their mindset. And I almost see the difference of what you guys are both like expert on, like from the molecular to performance and from the mindset to performance, being a really cool combination of everything that you kind of need. And then you both are coaches. So I think that's super cool. But Mo, I'm curious on the mindset front, especially you talked about learning a new sport from the beginning. What is needed is you think about, because one of the things I think about all the time is brain aging. And one of the best things for the brain as you age is learning some new skill. And so what is needed from a learner's perspective? What kind of mindset, what can we do to help people understand how to learn better?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and at the base of it, I think you're alluding to it. It's just the openness around being willing to engage in something that we haven't done before, and that part can be uncomfortable of not knowing and stepping into something that is you'll fail, right? And it's very different from when we were children, and everything was an exploration, and the approach and the mindset was exactly that. Is very different, and so it takes that. Almost like meta perspective of going back and saying, this is something I want to do. I want to become better, and bringing that intentionality around it, which allows for all the parts of our brain that say, hey, this is bad. We shouldn't do this. We don't know, to allow it to quiet down just a tad, for you to give yourself an opportunity to explore. And sometimes it won't be fun, right? That's the deal that we have to accept, but it can be. Hard things can be fun. And we've as adults, we've done it in the past, but it's easy to get away from those types of things as we age and we kind of settle into who we are and who we think we are and who we'll be forever. And we kind of avoid a little bit of that neuroplasticity and just that plasticity of behavior in a way.
Yeah. What are some like practical skills you'll use with athletes to help them kind of quiet that chatter that's telling them like, this is scary, I shouldn't do this, this is dangerous for me? Like
Yeah.
what, any skills that you use with them?
First, it's the acknowledgement. The awareness is the main piece, right? Like, hey, what you're feeling, yes, you're feeling that, identifying that as whether that's fear, uncomfortability, uncertainty, whatever it is that how they have named it, being okay with that at first. And then beginning to say, okay, we can kind of go down two different paths, like depending on personalities, and if it's something that where we can work through changing that approach to thought. You're thinking this way, or you think you can't do it, but what if you can do it? And then the alternative path is, yes, you feel like you may not be able to, but what does that get us from here? This almost path of acceptance, right? So you have this cognitive behavioral shift, or you can go down the route of acceptance of, yes, you are where you are now, but how do we move forward from it? And those are like the two main pathways, just depending on the personality of a young athlete and what their goals are and what they intend to do, and using that as the carrot, kind of looking out, so they can achieve what they're trying to achieve.
It's so interesting that like acceptance, I mean, for your psyche kind of across the board is so important. Happiness, how you relate with others in relationship, and even with performance as an athlete.
Yep.
That's fascinating to me. Morgan, I'm curious on the on kind of the molecular and mindset. Do you find athletes, and maybe they're blinded to all their data, but maybe they pay attention to how they sleep or whatever. Like, do you find athletes ever limiting their mindset based on markers that they're tracking? And how do you try to like coach them around that?
Yes. Yeah. It's like a double-edged sword of having so much access to data, is that we can get really bogged down into it. And something that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to bring back up is human performance. We often forget the human aspect of not just someone performing, but like you mentioned it too, like community, relationship. When you're working with someone, it's like, or you have a participant, you say their name. They're not just like, oh, you're 00. Like being able to like connect with people. And so especially when we're working with data and athletes having access to data, I always remind them, it's like, before you check your metrics, before you check your readiness score, check in with yourself first. How do you feel? And so something Mo and I tell our kids all the time is, if you have a not great process and you have a not great outcome, we can't be upset that we didn't get the outcome that we wanted, because we looked at our process and it's like, well, we can see that coming. And so particularly like with readiness scores, sleep data, that kind of stuff, it's like, if you slept horribly, you can't be surprised that your sleep score is not, top, like tip top. And so I think it's being able to help athletes check in with themselves first. Like even if it's nutrition, if it's energy wise, anything like that, it's like, well, check in and see, how have you been taking care of yourself? What does your process look like? And then you can kind of go to these different metrics and details to add a little bit more color to this story. But I try to put the human at the very center. Like, let's check in here first. And then it comes to like that autonomy piece. And I think data can be helpful to learn how to interpret what your body is feeling. If that kind of makes sense. So like, I'll give an example for myself. Like, I got an Oura ring and I was like, I sleep great, my energy's good, whatever. And then consistently, it was just like, your heart rate never gets to resting during the day. You are just always like on high alert. And so being able to use that on a more like high level, on a high level, was really helpful for me versus, looking at every single day. And we don't recommend that people look at all of their metrics every single day, because we know that they can change based on a number of things. And so I like to look at weekly is really like how low I'll go. But it's like weekly, monthly, especially if they're in certain seasons, it's like, okay, let's look at the preseason as a whole. And also being able to add that context in. So for preseason, a lot of it is pretty ugly. It's hard. Like you have two-a-days, you have long practices, you're conditioning. So there are going to be times where your recovery is not tip top, or you're not feeling 100%. And that's, it's kind of the point, right? Because we're trying to like super compensate eventually. And so it's really bringing in that context of, okay, how are we interpreting all of our metrics, it's super important, because if we just look at, readiness score, and I think that for athletes or anyone that's a performer or that needs to execute on a certain day, you got to perform no matter what the day is, no matter what your readiness score is, no matter what your metrics are, and so I think it's really important to have that like approach and mindset when you're looking at different metrics, is that, and I think being able to modify how much you access those metrics based on your likelihood of interpreting it a certain way. So again, for another example, I have some athletes like, I can't check it every day because it's going to alter the way that I think about how I'm going to perform. And that's okay. I mean, there's probably some tips and tricks that we can do there, but I think it's okay to not want all this access to your data, knowing how it's going to, push you to operate. And so I think it's learning what is the best way to get you to perform? What metrics do you enjoy looking at, or which ones is just like a detriment to you? And if it's not working, throw it out. I think that's another thing with data, is like, oh, I have to have access to everything. We don't. And a lot of it's, it's still working on being accurate. Like, we're still having some accuracy issues too. And that's just, it's another reason why we take it with like a slightly large grain of salt, but still a grain of salt in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. You pointed out, like, games don't get rescheduled. Races don't get rescheduled based on your readiness score. Like, you just got to go perform. And I think the other interesting thing is this idea that, like, these are tools and you should use these tools to benefit you. And if they're not benefiting you, and, kind of in my practice with the members of Bionic Health, what I'll see is, some people will become totally enthralled with sleep, and they may spend all their time thinking about sleep, and they kind of, and sleep is important. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's foundational. You need to make sure that you're sleeping and recovering and stuff like that. But then also, I love that you said, like, check in with yourself before you look at the metric, because people will start to care more about the metric than how they feel. And so I'm curious, Mo, when you work with people on mindset and they're pulling in metrics, and you're seeing like a metric that is like a tool that they're using that is not helping them, how do you work with them to kind of let go of that tool? Or how do you help them adopt the right tools to be successful?
Yeah, it can be tough, right? Because we all, now that we have the data, we all want to lock in and leverage the data as best that we can. And it quickly becomes the end state instead of a proxy for what we're trying to figure out. And I think that disconnecting that relationship is really where it goes back to being a tool and being valuable for the process. And so one of the easiest things is just to offer a little bit of contrast in terms of, hey, was there a time you performed well where you didn't feel well, right? Like, just pregame was the worst beginning. It was awful. Warm up was terrible. You didn't think it was going to go well. And during the game, you performed well. And so how do you offer that as like an example, a sample for something that could very much happen with their information, with their data that they're looking at on a day to day? Because just that shift and that contrast in terms of, this is what you think it happened, and then this is what it actually happened, can be very valuable. And we know that there's a little bit of challenge, right, to that in terms of perception can create reality. And so how can we then challenge that as well and be able to open that up and have a discussion around it? So I would say that just one of the biggest tools is offering that contrast of past experiences. And in cases where athletes have a favorite athlete or somebody that they really kind of want to see themselves in terms of performance, is offering that label, like, hey, in this situation, what do you think this person would do? Or this kind of perspective shifting that offers them a path to think about things differently. That begins to expand. Yeah. So those are a couple of things.
I love that. One of my least favorite stories in sports is I grew up in Utah, so I'm a big Stockton Malone fan, Utah Jazz. Mm-hmm. And Jordan came in, got the flu, and had like one of his best games, won another championship against the Jazz. And like, such a cool story that you don't have to be feeling your best to still perform amazingly. I don't like the story because the Jazz never won a championship, but yeah, just it is so important to remember, like, there are so many factors that go into human performance. It is not just a score, a metric. The thing that we can get totally fixated on may not be the thing that is most important for us.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
exactly. Just like it also can offer an opportunity to challenge what you feel, right? And so to your point around Jordan having the flu game, like I can imagine based on other stories that I've heard around Jordan that he probably kind of turned it up, was like, hey, I'm gonna go a little bit harder today. And providing that we have a very limited window and kind of context of not go hard forever, but how can you challenge yourself in the moment that you're feeling and show yourself you can do hard things, right? This is gonna be uncomfortable, and let's try to nail it as best we can. So I think that example serves as like another alternative to just, hey, let's flip it on for the moment here.
Yeah. And I actually like that point, like deciding you can do some hard things and that it's for a limited time. And it makes me think about things that you're studying, Morgan, like lactate. Like, can you use these metrics to help people push past barriers or to do more than they think they're able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, and even like the opposite is true of, people thinking that there's either a ceiling or like, oh, like my readiness score tells me I'm good to go. And then like it lacks that effort of like, yes, and you still have to put in the work. You still have to put in the effort to kind of get there. And so, yeah, I think it's a really great example, and something that we've done recently is we did like an exercise test that we were hoping to get a lactate response on soccer players. And after they did the test, their lactates were resting. Like they were the same. And so, and like the athletes were like, oh no, like I feel like I worked hard. And like your lactate is 1. It is like, it has not gone up at all. And so I think it can be really helpful in terms of providing that context if there's that education piece with it, because it is pairing that subjective and objective. And sometimes they match, sometimes they don't, and that's okay. We're just kind of like, we're all out here trying to figure it out, but it can be really helpful, especially with something that can change pretty rapidly. Something like lactate, because your body is like literally producing energy and it's trying to go. And so it can be really helpful in that way. So absolutely, it can definitely push athletes or push people to kind of say like, hey, this is what your body is telling us right now. This is what's happening internally. And then can we match that with your mindset mentally, and then like your external performance as well. And it can be really helpful in terms of effort.
Yeah, that's a funny anecdote about the soccer players. I've definitely, I did a little bit of coaching of like youth basketball in the past, and definitely been in practices where I see a different reality than my players. They think they're giving full effort and I'm not seeing it. So it's actually kind of cool to have like a metric that you can be like, actually your muscles are not struggling at all, because I can see it in your blood. That's kind of fascinating. So yeah, go ahead, Morgan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think it's, as you kind of progress in whatever your movement or your sport is, it's also like that learning experience of how hard can you go, and like how hard, what's like your hard level, I think is really helpful, like especially with youth athletes or athletes that are still kind of building their training age. They don't really know what their capacity is. And that's kind of the point, right? Like they're new to something. So like things feel hard. And like we see that, especially in like resistance training studies. Like, I've taken untrained people into the weight room and they'll push the leg sled or the leg press, and they'll be like, okay, that's it. Like that feels hard, and then it's like, it's them actually learning what their body is capable of. And I think it's also like combating that idea that, when things get hard, you have to stop. Or like if things feel difficult, or like, oh, I feel like my body's working. And it's like, yes, it's exactly like the start of where we want you to go. And it's like that learning process of really figuring out how do you push your body to like what your capacity is, and figuring out where that limit is. Like not necessarily, you're trying to find your 100%, but it's like, something might feel like it's an 8 out of 10, but it's like, we might learn that's more like 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10. And so it just takes repetitions, and that openness and comfortability with being uncomfortable is really important.
I like that you brought up kind of untrained individuals, because a lot of people that work with us, like they've never lifted before, they've never tried a VO2 max before, they've never done HIIT training before. And when we engage people in those things, it's really hard when you first start. But like you said, what feels really hard to you right now may not be nearly as hard as you could go, which I think goes so well back to mindset for Mo. And so, like, how do you help somebody that, this feels really hard, but their capacity is greater? How do you help them overcome that?
Yeah, the first part is just trust, right? Like, I think there's so much around as we become much more data using, right? That there's so much around all the other pieces that aren't the softer and relational skills. And so I'm sure as people are going into these exercising modes, it's a little bit around how they're introduced to them, and that comes with a person, right? And so if you want somebody to do something a little bit different, right, it's better to kind of meet them where they are instead of telling them just the information, right? If I give you the information, you still may not change your behavior, right? We all know that fruits and veggies are good. Not all of us eat them. So I think a huge piece of that is just meeting them where they are in that process and introducing themselves if they're kind of leading this charge into uncharted waters. But just a step. Well, just how can you go from where you are to where you want to be? You just have to take a step forward and lean into what is a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that we get lost in creating a whole process and a whole plan and what it'll be like. And some of the easy motivational factors are just the reminder of what it's going to feel like when you are doing it. It's going to feel really good. You're going to feel great, right? And then it's also, what's the first thing I can do? Maybe that's just, hey, I'm going to put my shoes in my car this week. And that's it. I will get to the gym eventually, but what is my first step? And I think then you begin to close that gap between those 2 points of knowing how you're going to feel at the end and what you're doing today that allow for that space. And that, just making it a smooth introduction.
I really like that reminder that it's just like a step at a time. I love to hike mountains, and you can never go from like beginning to end in one step.
Yeah.
Like, it's always such a good reminder that, like, to get to where you want to go, it is just the next step.
That's it.
And I think that's such a good reminder. So I would say this has been amazing. I'd love to hear kind of as we finish up, I'm going to give you both a minute or two to talk about, like, as you think about, talking to people out there that want to be healthier. They wouldn't be listening to this podcast if they didn't want to be healthier. Like, what are one or two things that you would say, hey, this is something I've learned, this is something I've taught others that I think you should apply or think about applying in your own life? And Morgan, let's start with you.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to go with Mel first. I would say two things. I'll probably not be able to limit it to one. The first would be to find a movement or an activity that you enjoy. I think that we've talked about the human experience, and we've talked about, like, things are going to be hard. The first time you do something, it's kind of not going to be perfect. It's not going to be easy. And I think it's aligning with something that you really enjoy doing. And especially now, I think there's so much, like, pushed in our face of, like, you have to do this, or top 3 things to do this, or this is the only way you can do this. And it's like, none of that is true. And finding some type of, if it's exercise that you want to get after, find an exercise that you enjoy. If it's something with food, find a food that is, it's literally just aligning with something that you enjoy and starting there. And the second thing is, I say this to everyone, it's my go-to line, but be kind to yourself. Things take time. Change takes time. And there's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be ebbs and flows. There's going to be steps forward, steps back. And so the more that you can remind yourself and actually be kind to yourself and show yourself some gratitude is going to assist with the process. And, because if it was easy, you would do it. If it was easy, it would be in your life, in your habits right away. And so, like Mo said, you can do hard things, and you can be kind to yourself as you're attempting to incorporate something into your life. And so just want to end with that of always be kind to yourself.
I love both of those. All right, Mo, your turn.
Yeah. I'm going to go with one that I heard during So I was watching Dwyane Wade's his statue speech unveiling, and his son said the closing line of his speech was "Enjoy the traffic," and it's something that I understand as like when we're trying to make behavior changes, right? We're trying to create a habit. We also can get so focused on the outcome or the goal that not understanding that the habit, the process that we're going through to change is the most valuable and beautiful part of it. And if we can, more so on the science side, if we can, a habit is an impulse to do something. So we're trying to get to the goal, but if we can create the impulse to act, to behave, to do, right, to perform, then we'll be able, the behavior itself will naturally come. And so enjoying that traffic, in essence, to me, it's like enjoying that process of creating the habit. Like it's going to be a battle, to Morgan's point. You're going to forget, you're going to be like, oh, I should have done this, but the process of being intentional about creating the time, creating the space to do it and have an error and go back to it and fall off the horse and get back on all the good things. But just enjoy that process of creating the habit, and then after it is habit, then it's easy. Then that's the part that comes down to.
I love that. You both earned PhDs, and I'm sure that you gained much more from the process than the day you put on the cap and gown and got your degree, right? So I absolutely love that reminder. And this has been absolutely amazing. Real quick before we go, is there anywhere that people should find you online if they want to know more about your work or what you're working on? Start with you, Morgan.
Yeah, absolutely. I am on LinkedIn. Morgan Smith is a very unpopular name, but Morgan Smith, Stanford. You can find me there. I'm also on Instagram at goldenmo_. Those are the best ways to find me. And then I also have a website, themoperformance.com, where my email's on there if you wanted to reach out to talk about anything performance, well-being. Would love to tap in with people.
Awesome. And Mo?
LinkedIn would be the best option. I'm on there all the time and working to build a better presence socially. So soon to come, but for now, just LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to another episode of Medicine 3.0. We make this podcast so that you know where to turn for good information on keeping you and your loved ones healthy. Feel free to check us out at bionichealth.com, where we can help you live a longer, happier life.